Welcome, searchers and seekers. We are in the book of Deuteronomy, which is book 5 of the Pentateuch or the Torah. And this book, Deuteronomy, is the primary one where we get a sense of Moses as lawgiver. So this is very important for the sense of who Moses was. Yes, Moses helped take the Israelites out of Egypt and guided them through the desert, but here we have a full pronouncement of the Torah. Now, the Torah is sometimes translated as the law. So if we thought of terms of secular law, we would think of laws about business and crimes. But Torah is much more encompassing than that. It's law, it's social practices, it's individual practices, what you can do as a person, and it's religious law, spiritual law. So it really encompasses all of those things. So it's a comprehensive teaching law that grounds every aspect of human life. So it's meant to be a complete teaching. So Torah has that sense. Now Deuteronomy here is set before the tribes who have been wandering the desert enter into Canaan, and Moses is speaking to them. So we don't know if this is really historical, but if it were historical, it would be about the year 1200, 1100. David would be, and Solomon would be around 1000 to 900, and then the exile would be 587 BCE. And scholars think that the book of Deuteronomy may have not reached its final form until after the exile, so about in the 500s BCE. So although the text portrays itself as happening about 1200 BCE, it may not have been written until much later. And that's important because it sheds some light on the content of Deuteronomy. So in Deuteronomy, the holy mountain of Mount Sinai, where the Ten Commandments were given, where God appeared. In Deuteronomy, it's Mount Horeb. So we don't know if it's two different mountains that were later joined in this literary work and in other literary works of the Pentateuch. We don't know if it's two different mountains or two different names for the same mountain. We don't know where the mountain is. Nevertheless, it's very interesting that this gives evidence for there being many sources, many literary documents for the Pentateuch, because they're using two widely different names for the same mountain. In chapter 128, we see this interesting report of those who have traveled into Canaan sort of as spies. The people are stronger and taller than we. The cities are large and fortified up to heaven. We actually saw there the offspring of the Anakim, and previously we've seen the sons of the Nephilim. So there are these really big people, these giants who live in the land, which makes us think a lot of this is some ancient memory of some mythological type. In 2:30, we read, "But King Sihon of Heshbon was not willing to let us pass through, for the Lord your God, Yahweh your Elohim, had hardened his heart and made his heart defiant in order to hand him over to you, as he has done now." So this again, this idea of hardening the heart, and God is influencing the leaders of other tribes and kingdoms so that he can show his glory in defeating them. And yet in other cases, we see the Israelites are defeated and they have to go around various lands. So it's a very much a mixed bag of different ways in which the divine is conceived as fighting for or not fighting for Israel. So I'm going through Deuteronomy a bit quickly because the Bible is such a large text, and I'm going to be focusing on certain points and not doing a chapter by chapter reading as we did for Genesis. So 4:15 and following. This is a very interesting passage on um, idols and against idolatry that has been very important in Western religion. Since you saw no form when the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire, take care and watch yourselves closely, so that you do not act corruptly by making an idol for yourselves, in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any animal that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird, the likeness of anything that creeps, any fish. And when you look up to the heavens and see the sun, the moon, the stars, all the host of heaven, do not be led astray and bow down to them or serve them. So don't worship planets, stars, the moon, things that the Lord has allotted to all the peoples everywhere under heaven. But the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron smelter, out of Egypt, to become a people of his very own possession, as you are now. So the idea that you don't make idols to represent the divine, and the idea that they saw no form of the divine at Sinai or Horeb. This is very profound, I think, and very influential. The idea that you cannot make an image for the imageless. There is, in a sense, no form for the divine. In 425 and following, we see that if the Israelites do worship idols, God, Yahweh, can be provoked to anger, the people will be scattered. Then you will have to serve other gods made by human hands, objects of wood and stone that neither see nor hear, nor eat nor smell. And yet God is a forgiving God, that they can come back to him. And Moses tells them to remember the wonders of their rescue from Egypt. Has any God ever done anything like this? At the same time, the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures are very henotheistic, with a belief in one primary God, their national God. So in a sense, yes, every culture, almost every culture has this, where they have a totemistic God who is their God, representative of their society, a symbol of who they are, something that unifies them, cares for them, fights for them. So even Yahweh will be a militaristic God. And the text also talks about other gods existing. It's not just idols uh, for nothing, but these are idols of other gods that make Yahweh jealous. So this is an interesting passage on how the religion worked at this time. It's henotheistic. It's anti-idolistic. You're not supposed to have idols. You're not supposed to worship other gods. If you do, there'll be punishments, but you can come back because Yahweh is a forgiving God. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, we have a few words that introduce another section. Moses convened all Israel and said to them. So this is a new section, and it starts out with what we call the Ten Commandments. And again, it is henotheistic. You shall have no other gods before me. So it's not quite clear that there actually are no other gods. It's not strict monotheism. And these Ten Commandments represent, we could argue, a tremendous consolidation of human wisdom. Why is this important? Why are these things important? Because without what the Ten Commandments is saying in terms of human behavior, the very fabric of society is going to break down. Um, people will start killing each other literally if you steal from them, if you commit adultery, if you bear false witness in a legal case where there's punishments. Um, and so these ethical laws are very important. And really, they're a consolidation of ethical thinking. In chapter 6, Deuteronomy 4 and following, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. You shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart." So this is the Shema, a very important Jewish prayer. And this idea of love of God, what does this mean? Does this mean that you should have this mystical, ecstatic, emotional experience of love with God? Um, Many scholars are saying that this idea of love, ahab, is meaning loyalty, respect, devotion, because many of the political leaders would ask for the love of their uh, servants and citizens. So it's sort of like a loyalty. The idea of love here perhaps has more of a meaning of be loyal to. So God wants them to be loyal. Heart in this case for the Hebrew philosophy would be both human intellect, knowledge, and will, and soul would mean who you are as a person, your soul, your individual um, energy, you could say, and sometimes might is added, or capacity. So heart is not just meaning emotional, but heart is more comprehensive than our English sense of the word heart. In Deuteronomy 7, early part of the chapter, we see how God is going to help them conquer the peoples of Canaan. And they are listed here. There are many that they never could conquer because they were not strong enough. The Philistines, for one, on the coast. And nevertheless, this is here we will see a very militaristic way of looking at Yahweh. When Yahweh your God brings you into the land that you are about to enter and occupy, and he clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, and Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations mightier and more numerous than you, and when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must utterly destroy them. So this is genocidal. This is destroying other cities and nations and cultures completely. Make no covenant with them and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. That would turn you away from following me to serve other gods. Again, this idea of henotheism, or a monolatry of there are many gods, but we only worship one. Or henotheism, the idea that there are many gods, but we focus on belief in one. And then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. So that is a theme in the Hebrew Scriptures, that the Israelite people are not just blessed by God, but God will punish them, destroy them. And so we will see this in the Hebrew Scriptures repeatedly. When something goes wrong for Israel, the prophets and writers will look for an explanation in the alleged fact of the people having worshipped other gods and not being faithful to God, who's a jealous God who gets angry and then will destroy them. But this is how you must deal with them. Break down their altars, smash their pillars, hew down their sacred poles, and burn their idols with fire. For you are a people holy to the Lord, to Yahweh your God. Yahweh your God has chosen you out of all the peoples of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. So here we have some nationalistic exclusivism, that the God here in the Hebrew Scriptures is a national God who is focused just on this particular nation. So what is God doing with other peoples of the earth here? Um, we see some universalistic religion in the Hebrew Scriptures, but here, this passage, we definitely don't. And again, this reflects most likely what happened after this 1200 where the speech was given. This is probably a reflection of many centuries of fighting with the Canaanites. So this is sort of retrojection. This is retrocasting. This is sort of counting the history of several hundred years and putting it into the mouth of Moses. So it's not what will happen, it's what has already happened. In 7:12, we have more along these lines. And this is a little bit materialistic. It deals with the blessings. So if the Israelites keep to their side of the covenant, the agreement, if they love God, God will love them back. And it's more of being loyal. If we are loyal to God, God will bless us. So love has that connotation. If you heed these ordinances, Yahweh, your God, will maintain with you the covenant loyalty that he swore to your ancestors. So covenant, just a word for agreement, but it's an agreement between, it's an important agreement. Sometimes it would be the same sort of covenant between two tribes, two tribal leaders, or a larger nation, a mega nation, and the lesser nations. Uh, Egypt and lesser nations, Mesopotamia and lesser nations. Suzantery treatise, where you want the loyalty of the city or nation for the larger, and those are often cast in terms of love. So if you keep all these covenants, he will love you. So Yahweh will love you, bless you, and multiply you. He will bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your ground, the grain and wine, cattle. So this is a very materialistic understanding of religion, that if you're devoted to the God of our nation, Yahweh, if you worship only him, make no idols, that you will be blessed. So you will have this great life of animals and fruit. So it's a very materialistic understanding. You shall be the most blessed of people. Barrenness will not be among your livestock. So God will have this sort of miraculous intervention that livestock will not be barren. The Lord will turn away illness and disease. And they are told, you shall devour all the peoples that Yahweh your God is giving over to you, showing them no pity. You shall not serve their gods. So it seems pretty clear that this is materialistic, militaristic, and henotheistic. It's looking at religion materialistically, that if you worship God in the right way, that your life will be blessed, that God will magically and miraculously make it occur. And it's militaristic. You are going to conquer these other nations. And it's henotheistic. It's these other nations have gods, and those gods are real, but you do not worship them. So this, in a sense, there's something to be highly critical of here as the Hebrew peoples try to understand what religion is going to be for them. In 9:4 and following, we have a sense of why God is dispossessing these other nations of their lands. When Yahweh, your God, thrusts them out before you, do not say to yourselves, it is because of my righteousness that Yahweh has brought me to occupy this land. It is rather because of the wickedness of these nations that Yahweh is dispossessing them right before you. So part of the explanation would be that these are wicked, evil people, all these nations, and so somehow they are going to be conquered, literally killed, and the Israelites get to take their land. So this is a very dangerous and problematic aspect of the Hebrew Scriptures. In chapter 10:12, so now, O Israel, what does Yahweh your God require of you? Only to fear the Lord, to respect Yahweh, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord, to serve Yahweh. So to love, to serve. That's in chapter 10, verse 12. And yet we look at verse 19. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So there is a sense when the stranger comes into your land that you must love and care for them. But love, not in the sense of this emotional love, but to love the stranger means to respect the stranger, to abide by this desert rule, this migrant Bedouin rule of hospitality, love the stranger, care for the stranger. And then in 11:13, God is commanding, I am commanding you today, loving Yahweh your God and serving him. So loving and serving, being devoted. Being devoted might be a nice translation. Being devoted, being loyal, and serving. And they're mentioned here together, so sort of loving and serving. It's not really commanding an emotional response, but a response of loyalty. Chapter 12 starts a section where there really is a new code here, and this code is very important for Deuteronomy. So whoever was the source for Deuteronomy, we don't actually have much information about who exactly wrote this and for what purpose, but one of the things that is important for Deuteronomy is a centralized worship, centralized sacrifices. You must demolish completely all the places where the nations whom you are about to dispossess served their gods, the mountain heights, the trees. Break down their altars, their pillars. You shall not worship the Lord your God in such ways. So again, we have the idea that this has occurred after the emergence of Israel. I don't want to call it the conquest, because that's how the early Hebrew scriptures, Joshua makes it seem. Like we have these 12 tribes, they just come in. The process was probably much more involved of local peoples, some migratory tribes, coming in, staying there, mixing of religion. We have different names for God, different tribes, different patriarchs. So it is much more involved. And then once we have that, we have sort of a centralization of those tribes. And that probably occurred in the years BC 800, 700. And now we're seeing that this is retrojected, put back into the mouth of Moses. And so the idea is that some future time, there's going to be a centralized place for worship. Instead of all these mountain hilltops near the people, they're going to try to make a more centralized religious place of worship. On this idea of a centralized place of worship, James Kugel writes, quoting from the works, or making reference to the works of De Wet, argued that there's no real evidence of a central sanctuary in the Bible before the time of King Josiah in the 7th century BCE. So just before the Babylonian exile. On the contrary, not only Genesis, but also books like Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and this is a period long after Moses, unhesitatingly and without criticism report on various biblical figures offering up sacrifices wherever they liked. So now if we have this change, we have to explain why. Why was it okay for all the early prophets, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and others, in these books, Judges and Samuel, long after Moses? Why was it the practice that they could sacrifice without any problem? Now it is changing. So again, this leads scholars to think that this is a way of dating Deuteronomy to much later than 1200. So probably closer to finally being written down, finally in its final version, and even after the exile, and after the return from the exile, so maybe even as late as 500. In chapter 16, there is a listing of the important holidays for Israel, and what is missing is the Day of Atonement, which has become the preeminent holiday, or at least one of the two or three. It's not mentioned here in Deuteronomy chapter 16, which makes scholars think that in the early parts of the history of Israel, 1200 to 600, it was not an important religious holiday. In Deuteronomy 21:22, we have this passage on the burial of a corpse. And I mention this because this is important for the gospel tradition of Christians. When someone is convicted of a crime punishable by death and is executed, and you hang him on a tree, his corpse must not remain all night upon the tree. You shall bury him that same day. So that was important for the gospel. We are in Deuteronomy 32 for the Song of Moses, the poem of Moses. And this is a very interesting section. Chapter 32:4, the rock, or God, Yahweh, his work is perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God without deceit. Just and upright is he. So God is described in terms of a metaphor as the rock. And yet his children, or Israel, have dealt falsely with him. We're not exactly sure about the Hebrew word there, but it is called a perverse and crooked generation. And I believe Paul of Tarsus makes reference to that in one of his letters, a perverse and crooked generation. Yet God is referred to as a father. Is not he your father who created you? So this idea of creation, God as father. Verse 8, God is described as the Most High, El Yon. El, as in Elohim, this word that means God in many of the Semitic languages, El Yon, and it's usually translated Most High, but that I think is really done more out of ignorance than anything else. And it is mentioned here that the boundaries of the peoples are fixed according to their number of their gods. So this idea of henotheism, there are various gods over various nations. Nevertheless, Israel is the apple of his eye. 32:11, as an eagle stirs up its nest of young and hovers over its young and spreads its wings, takes them up and bears them aloft. So that's a motherly image of the divine. And we have another one in 18. You are unmindful of the rock that bore you, that gave birth to you. So a motherly image. And you forgot the God that gave you birth. And yet God is jealous. He will hide his face from them. So this idea of going away from hide one's face. In 21, they made me jealous with what is no God. So this idea that perhaps these other gods are no gods. So this idea may be moving more towards a stricter kind of monotheism. And yet the poem gets a little difficult and angry. I will heap disasters upon them, spend my hours against them, wasting, hunger, burning, consumption, bitter, pestilent. The teeth of beasts I will send against them, the venom of things crawling in the dust. In the street the sword shall bereave, and in the chambers terror, for young men and women alike, nursing child and old gray head. I thought to scatter them, to blot them out. So should God destroy them? But then God's enemies would say, our hand is triumphant. It was not the Lord that did this. So he doesn't want the other nations to take credit for that if he destroyed them. So that's partly why the rock, does not destroy them. Yahweh is talking about his enemies in 32. Their vine comes from the vine stock of Sodom, from the vineyards of Gomorrah. Their grapes are the grapes of poison, the grapes of wrath. And in 39, see now that I, even I, am he. There is no God besides me. I kill and make alive. I wound and I heal, and no one can deliver from my hand. God is described as a God of judgment. As I live forever, when I whet my flashing sword, when I sharpen my flashing sword, and my hand takes hold on judgment, I will take vengeance on my adversaries. I will repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood. My sword shall devour flesh, and the blood of the slain and the captives from the long-haired enemy. So God can kill the enemies of Israel, his enemies. It's very beautifully described. It's very descriptive. He says, there's no God besides me. So this is the idea, again, of henotheism moving to monotheism, belief in many gods moving to more of belief in one God.